Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm Peggy Northrop. I'm the CEO of Watermark, and I'm honored to have with me today Cami Anderson, founder of Third Way Solutions and a leader in education, for this conversation on advocating for equity at every level of an organization. Now, all month long, our programs have focused on the doing of DE&I, of diversity, equity, and inclusion, what's working to create cultures of belonging, where the most stubborn barriers exist and what we can do to overcome those, and where are there bright spots that can inspire us. So as a 5-time CEO of large and complex organizations, including as superintendent of schools in New York City and in Newark, and now working, I just learned this morning, working in LA on the same kinds of issues, Cami is uniquely positioned to address some of these issues and also to explain why women's leadership skills are especially valuable and needed right now. So just a few more things about Cami. She is also the co-founder of Roads, a network of charter high schools dedicated to court-involved youth. She's the former executive director of Teach for America in New York City, chief program officer of New Leaders for New Schools, and policy and issues director for Cory Booker. Cami currently leads Third Way Solutions, an organization dedicated to finding innovative solutions to the most vexing problems facing government, nonprofit, corporate, and philanthropic organizations in the pursuit of equity. She's widely published, from the Wall Street Journal to Education Week. She's an Aspen Fellow. She's won a fistful of civic awards and was recognized by Time Magazine as one of the world's 100 most influential leaders. So we all have a lot to learn from you, Cami. Thank you again for being with us today. So I just wanted to begin by talking about, you've worked in such big systems, big educational systems, big complex systems where nimbleness is not exactly the watchword, right? That's not what we associate with those kinds of companies and organizations. Can you give us some examples of how you've worked in those systems to create systemic change? What are the barriers and what are your techniques?
Sure. First of all, Peggy, thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure meeting you recently. So this feels a little bit like destiny. Thanks for the time, and thanks to everyone who dialed in today. I guess I'll start by saying a couple things, and then obviously we can go wherever the energy takes us. So two sort of essential points. One is I've found over the course of my career that particularly when it comes to large, complex organizations that are stuck in their ways, and that can apply to corporate folks. We work with a lot of corporations currently, nonprofits, and certainly large government agencies, of which I've been a part. I've worked in all, right? So one is, it's really important how actively you stop doing things as it is how actively you start new things, right? So often what happens when we have dysfunctional organizations that are not rooted in equity, that are not high performing, folks want to put ornaments on an unhealthy or worse, dead tree, right? And we just put ornaments and ornaments, and we never have the courage to sort of step back and say, is the tree actually healthy? And is this even the right tree, right? So one is, we use a framework called sustain, start, and stop. And I'll just walk you through a couple examples because I can't stand when these things get real theoretical. So for example, in government, one of the things you need to sustain are the folks that are getting it done, that are intrapreneurs. We call them entrepreneurs, folks inside the organization, quietly making things happen, often off the radar, sometimes in trouble, and they always exist, right? So one thing you need to sustain are the practices and just emotional safety for those individuals, and lift them up, set them free them from whatever constraints they've been dealing with, whether it's policies, poor management, buried 3 layers below someone who was squashing them. So that's an example of something that you want to sustain, and that's worked really well for me in all the organizations that I've run. The second is you want to start things. So in government, it might surprise folks, although I've seen this in corporate America too. Generally, you don't do what we call goal-based budgeting. Your budget looks like this. Peggy, you got $100 this year, you get $105 next year, and you have 45 line items, and some accountant, does a +1%, -5%, -2%. And no one ever sort of steps back and says, wait, what are we trying to accomplish? And taking it all the way down to the studs, almost a whiteboard exercise. What are our 5 big priorities, and how do we align our cash to our goals? And how do we put in place systems to make sure that that's actually working, and define moments in time to look back and see if it's aligned. So that's an example of a start goal-based budgeting. This is like a huge idea, believe it or not. It is amazing to me how money just rolls. And especially right now, we're about to invest an unprecedented amount of money in government and in education in particular. And that money shouldn't just be parked in cost centers that already exist, right? We need a real theory of action that's based in real goals. And we just start new budgeting systems that are transparent, goal-minded. And that's often pretty hard in government because a lot of the money is wrapped up in individuals and contracts and existing work that may or may not be the right work, right? So then the last thing is to stop things, right? And I'll give you a couple examples of that. So when I was the superintendent of alternative high schools in New York City, we had something called the Program for Pregnant and Parenting Teens, which I guess on paper sounds like a decent idea, but actually it was pretty much a relic of the 1950s, where mostly Black and brown and poor girls who became pregnant were kicked out of their high schools, which for those of you playing along at home is illegal, but it still happened. And they were literally put in basements in New York City in this program where folks tried to convince me that knitting was akin to, algebra, and writing cards was akin to English language arts. And it was just such a profoundly broken system in terms of how girls got there, what was or wasn't happening while they were there. Some things are too broken to be fixed. We had to stop that. We closed those programs and we took that money and invested it in school-based childcare centers so that girls who are attending high school could actually put their baby, and fathers, right, which was the other sort of absurdity of the approach, right there in their own high school and attend schools. And by the way, wealthy white girls who became pregnant stayed in their high schools. So this was also a very segregated system. So we had to stop that. Just like we have to stop criminalizing the way we think about student behavior in schools. Do you know that when a student, for example, throws an eraser across the room, right, which is, teenagers, they're supposed to test authority. This is part of their job, right? So when that happens, one could actually receive an out-of-school suspension. If you're Black and brown, then you're 3.5 times more likely for that to be the case. You then get a summons, you go to a hearing, you have to plead guilty or not guilty. Remember, we're talking about an eraser here. And this is often the beginning of a connection to the juvenile justice system, which then sends you on to the adult justice system. So that's another example of something we just have to stop. We have to do an entire audit of how we think about student behavior and just stop criminalizing it and stop doing it in a way that's intensely biased. So to go back to the original question, right, the really hard work of turning around and making organizations high performing involves what you stop doing as much as what you sustain and as much as what you start. And I'll just say one last quick thing, I promise. The other thing that I always try to hold myself to a very, very high standard on is to really go for what we call the adaptive changes, not just the technical changes. And the adaptive changes are deeply held beliefs and what people value and their mindsets, right? That's really hard to change. And it takes time and often discomfort. And that's the stuff of lasting, deep, revolutionary change. So we like to put Band-Aids on things. So for example, a school system that I go and say, decriminalize the way you think about behavior. They go hire a whole bunch of behavior assistants. That might be helpful, technical fix. The adaptive fix is helping every adult in the system examine their own personal biases and deepen a really huge toolkit around ways to meet young people where they are, to de-escalate crises, to empower them. So stop as much as you start, right? 1, and 2, really, really keep your eye on those deeper adaptive changes and don't fool yourself. The technical changes necessary, policies, procedures, that is not the stuff of revolutionary change, whether it's in corporate America or in government. The adaptive shifts are the ones that you're going for.
Right. So interesting. And of course, I'm thinking about the police forces and, police reform and all of the things that we were talking about so urgently right now in the same way. It's like, if nobody knows how to de-escalate, then you've got more people dying. So very, very interesting. I'm curious. So many of the people who are on our call today, and I hope you will ask put your questions in the chat. We'll get to them certainly by the end, but really, really curious to hear how people and how you would relate this to a corporate context. I mean, what are you seeing inside corporations that are, what I'm seeing is lots of people hiring DEI specialists, lots of people doing storytelling sessions, lots of people putting a lot of burden on their Black and brown employees to educate the rest of the company in terms of what's going on in terms of racism and equity. And how do you take that lens of the things that you have to stop and start doing into a corporate setting?
Yeah, great question. We are doing a lot of work with corporations now, and I'll start with some bad news, and I'll give some good news. Unfortunately, I'm seeing a lot of what you're seeing as well, which is folks taking an approach that is not really diverse, it's not really equity minded, and that's not really inclusive, right? In the name of DEI, right? So I'm seeing a lot of the same kinds of hiring practices that produce these suites that are mostly male, mostly white, without a critical examination of recruiting, selecting, onboarding, retaining, right? As an example, and then folks say, well, we just can't find the candidates, which is, to me, code for we haven't done a critical examination of why we're dipping into the same pool, where we're getting our recommendations, how our selection criteria are crafted to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, who's at the table when those decisions are made. So the examples I gave are what we should be doing, but what I'm seeing is not a lot of real commitment to looking at the senior levels, the management levels, the data that shows who gets promoted, and to really getting under the hood of the entire continuum. Who do we recruit, select, onboard, retain, and why? And if you keep producing the same homogeneous group, right, then you have to start with the assumption you're not getting it right, as opposed to, and that a careful examination of that process will reveal where in that continuum you're getting it wrong and how you can fix it, which is what we help companies do. But if your initial assumption is, well, we just can't find the candidates, or they're not getting through the process, that's a mindset shift that needs to occur. If you are producing the same homogeneous C-suite, then you're missing something, right? And we can help you with that other people, but that requires some intellectual honesty and sometimes some courage as a leader. Mm-hmm. The not prioritizing equity is another big one, right? So there are people and organizations across the country, corporate, government, who, as I suggested to you, are just getting it done, right? And they have not received coaching. They don't necessarily have social capital. They don't go, to the happy hour or the golfing outing, or, have dinner because they know so-and-so's family. So equity is investing more in pipeline development. It's finding your up and coming women, people of color, individuals who show promise, and they exist in every organization. They just often don't, they often aren't at the table, not because of lack of quality or performance, but because they don't have access to those tables for reasons that are generational and for all the reasons that we know. And then finally, on the inclusive side, there's a lot of very compelling evidence when it comes to corporate culture that is not, by the way, dissimilar to school culture, which is that if you feel psychologically, physically, and emotionally safe, you're performing, right? That's the bottom line of inclusion. It's beyond just nice to have, right? Mm-hmm. We know that companies with diverse C-suites perform better, right? We know in companies that have thinner gaps between what employees say about their psychological, emotional, and physical safety, when those gaps close on employee surveys, performance gets unlocked. So somehow we see a lot of people thinking this inclusive thing is nice, right? It's over there, and whether or not the company is high performing and on a growth trajectory is over there, when in fact there's irrefutable evidence these things are inextricably tied. And again, we have tools to look at how people are feeling, and how people are feeling is actually critical to the output. I'll give a quick school example and a quick corporate example. About 20 years ago, the Center for Performance, CPRI in Chicago, did a long-term study of schools. And they surveyed all the stakeholders, parents, adults, kids, asked them what they were feeling, how they felt about the school, just hundreds and hundreds of questions over a decade. And they isolated the one thing that was most predictive of student performance was trust in and among adults. And we have seen corporate studies that replicate this. The bottom line is trusting relationships where people feel psychologically, emotionally, and physically safe, which is why so much of the important piece around physical safety has come out for women in particular, but not exclusively. So not particularly diverse, not particularly equitable, not particularly inclusive, although I gave you some arrows towards what success looks like. I'm going to give you a good news story, though. I'm going to give you an example of where I've seen almost the opposite. We have a client in rural Louisiana, in a part of rural Louisiana that has been under one of the longest standing court desegregation cases in the country. And this court desegregation case involves schools, but there, as you can imagine, multiple stakeholders involved. City government, county government, et cetera. So this group that one of our clients, I'll protect the innocent by not saying the name. They have literally spent the last almost 3 years on a journey that we would call mirrors and windows. So mirrors being truly self-examination, understanding their own biases. We all have them, race and otherwise, right? And then windows on once they had a set of values they wanted to implement, looking at everything from people, policy, practices, power dynamics, performance, just looking at the entire array in a very clear-eyed, courageous way. And I'll say there's 4 things that make this notable. One, the leader, white woman who grew up poor and said very transparently in one of our sessions, because I grew up so poor, I never considered race because I thought of myself as being underprivileged, which of course is true on some level as well. So just one, a courageous leader, I'm just using her as an example, who was willing to be on the journey, was willing to be transparent, and was willing to steer into conversations that she had never been in before. So that's that, and led by example, right? She dipped her toe in the water first, then she dove in the water, lead learner, courageous, willing to be uncomfortable, willing to be vulnerable. That was one. 2, the entire C-suite, which is diverse on all levels. And when we talk about diversity, we need to talk about people who identify as LGBTQ, differently abled, right? We're also getting stuck in a very narrow definition of diversity. Of course, race is omnipresent, and there are lots of ways that we sort and otherize people within institutions. So 2, the C-suite has been just all in, and having conversations and reading and videos and clips and in ways that are just beautiful to watch, pushing each other. There have been moments where the women have been pushed the men. There have been moments where folks who've identified as LGBTQ have pushed on the folks who don't identify that way, right? There have just been lots of really important moments across the entire C-suite. So that's the second thing. The third, it's been very much mirror work, but also windows. So we have taken a painstaking view at everything from enrollment to transportation, to discipline policies, to the way in which the system interacts with law enforcement, hiring, right? So you have to do both, right? You can't just have the book club, right? But at the same time, you can't just quickly go and take an eraser to your policies, right? So they've done the windows and the mirrors work. That's 3. And 4, they've been in it for the long haul. I think the really important news for everyone to hear, and it's just the reality, we are decades in the making of these racial and other isms, and we're not going to be months in the undoing of them, right? So really getting under the hood, they have been dogged and in this piece of work with us we're about to hit our 3-year marker. And I think if you talk to the leader, she would say, we're finally at the point where we're actually really seeing deep systems change. So some bad news, some good news.
Yeah.
and hopefully some tips for those of you out there doing this work.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really great. I mean, one of the things that I have been hearing a lot is people saying, okay, we're coming out of the pandemic. We're all going back to work. There will be a hybrid model. And, leadership just focused on getting people back in the office at a time when, the pandemic isn't over. The inequities aren't over. The trauma of this last year is still very, very much with us. I mean, I feel it personally. I've hit a wall recently, and it's like, I didn't lose anybody close to me. I'm okay. Yes, everybody in my family's unemployed except me, but still, it's like not a big problem. Um, and there are so many people who are now looking at coming back to work and saying, "Oh, wait a minute, I'm not ready. I'm not ready to face it." And when we think about the folks in our organizations who have been othered, who have been marginalized, that trauma is lasting. It's another burden to deal with. So I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of that returnship that I've heard it called, or returning to work, and what should we be expecting? What kinds of things should we be expecting of our companies right now as we head out of the pandemic and into whatever that next normal is going to be, besides the fact that it's going to take a long time? I mean, I think that's a really important message, that this is not undone in a day. It's not done by one hire. It's not done by one set of actions.
Mhm. Yeah, well, again, I'm going to go back to the psychological, emotional, and physical safety. We know these are prerequisites to performance, right? In order for you to truly show up as your whole self, to engage in deep and meaningful work, to get results, to coordinate and collaborate with your colleagues, you have to feel that way. And I would have said that pre-COVID, and especially now with the dual pandemic of the racial reckoning. And not that the racism didn't exist before, it's just in our face a lot more now, partly because of social media and partly because a few notable events cracked open the conversation in a different way. But between that and COVID, the sands have shifted, and so that has created a kind of collective trauma. Again, plenty of folks who are experiencing those isms were already feeling some of that trauma, and it just was put on blast, both in the last year. That plus obviously COVID, which, to your point, at best was destabilizing for everyone, and creating this like immense uncertainty, and at worst was awful. People losing multiple family members and homes and jobs and everything in between. So I would say that if you are a company that underinvested in the well-being of your staff, meaning placing a high premium on mental health, placing training and supporting managers who understand how to build trust, in addition to giving performance feedback, right? One doesn't go without the other. I think what's interesting is way too many leaders, government and corporate, think when they hear me talking about trust and safety, they think that I'm sort of like this soft person who doesn't believe in results. Couldn't be further from the truth. Unless you have trust and emotional safety, you can't give people evidence-based feedback that makes them better. You can't, it's almost impossible to hold folks accountable to doing their job, to hitting their mark, to making their growth goals, whatever the case may be. If you don't have a relationship with them where they feel emotionally and physically safe, then it's awfully difficult to motivate, coach, and get folks to the next level, or sometimes to coach them out, right? If that's what is necessary. So I think we're going to see, I'll make a prediction here. I think we're going to see companies that make big investments in recruiting individuals as much for their values as for their skills, in companies that place a high premium on managers who understand how to build culture and trust and relationships, in companies that align their corporate mission and values to equity and justice, and in companies that really take good care and make big investments in people's well-being. I'm going to go ahead and say that companies that do those things, if we fast forward 10 years from now, are going to be the ones that didn't just survive this moment, but thrived, right? And if you look at the data, I think that's sort of true now, uh, but it's sort of masked in all sorts of things. I think it's going to be crystal clear in the next 5 years.
Your lips to God's ears, as we used to say. Yes, I think that's really, really, and such an important point. We are starting to get some questions, which is wonderful. I want to ask you one thing about women's leadership during this time, because you've written about it so beautifully, and you've written about it specifically in the context of the pandemic. As we look around the world at the countries that did a better job, we were not on that list of doing a good job, not until recently anyway. But there were countries that were run by women where the women leaders took tough stands, as well as these kind of empathic stands. They modeled both of these qualities at once. And you talked about that in one of the things you wrote about this being almost a unique feature of women's leadership. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I write a column for Forbes called In the Room, and it's about women who have done big things and defied stereotypes to sort of realize big goals across different sectors. So it's super fun. It's like one of my favorite tasks. I try to do one once a quarter, and I wrote one about the data around COVID. In the early months of COVID, there was pretty irrefutable evidence to show that countries and provinces and other counties that were run by women were doing demonstrably better in curbing the spread of COVID, in overall deaths, et cetera, just sort of like hard data. And I'll tell you why I wrote this article, because I was even in that good news, like, so it was sort of this incredible thing, right? Like, you read one article, and then there was a group of folks, I think from USC Business School, that really dug in and sort of like affirmed the data. And then someone from Carnegie Mellon like affirmed the data. So this sort of like unfolded over 6 months, where people were like, huh, that seems to be the case. And then it was like, wow, it really is. And then it was like, holy cow, it really is. Even in that good news, I was so annoyed by how gendered the reporting was. It was all about, because women are so empathic, and women are so good at building relationships and telling stories in a way to move the public and whatnot. And I thought, maybe that's true, but I bet there's more to it. So I was like on this inquiry, because here I was thinking, oh, this is incredible. And I'm like, I'm not surprised, but the world seemed surprised, and the data seemed really compelling. My aunt, by the way, is an infectious disease control nurse. So I had her kick the data for me, because I was like, is this real? It seemed to be real. But I couldn't believe that everything being written about it was all about the quote soft skills, which, by the way, you've heard me talk about the soft skills. It's not that I don't value them, but I was like, there's got to be more to this. And so I dug into the research on how men and women in the C-suite lead. So I looked at a bunch of studies from McKinsey, E&Y, and just like sort of real data-driven research on the difference between CEOs who are women versus CEOs who are men, mostly corporate. There isn't a lot, sadly, in any other realm. And so what I discovered, which didn't surprise me, is not only are women more relational and more empathic in terms of how they lead. Generally speaking, of course, we're talking in generalities. Of course, there are men who are empathic and relationship minded, but this is in the aggregate. But they're also really good at three things that are very often left out of the story. One is vision setting. So women are really good at sort of setting a North Star and rallying folks around a North Star. The other is what they call direction setting. And that's sort of making sure that folks are organized, right? Everyone knows what their position is. They know what the North Star is. They know what everyone's role is. So vision setting, direction setting, and then motivating, right? So I'm a multi-sport athlete, I suppose, ex-athlete at this point, although I did do a triathlon a couple of years ago, not very fast. And from an athlete, from a sort of sports analogy, right? This is the equivalent of saying, all right, we're going to win the game. Here's the game plan, right? We'll check in at halftime to see if the game plan's working. We're not like making audibles on every, on every down. Um, and I know that, Sally needs a hug and Johnny needs, a one for the Gipper speech and, Susie needs more tactical advice about that particular play, right? So in general, those three qualities, plus the sort of instinct to be nurturing and empathic and build relationships, made for and in the embedded in the vision piece, which you alluded to, is being decisive. And so I just couldn't believe how little that was in the story, even in a moment where women were like doing the hard thing, right? One other thing I found, which I just have to put out there, and then I'll go wherever you want me to, but I also was super interested in this idea of women take less risks. So if you look at the literature, there are several sort of famous studies where it's like women are less risk takers. And of course, on its face, I'm like, that makes no sense. Like it seems negative, right? But when you dig in the research, because risk in our mental model, in our worldview, connotes bold, right? And male.
Right, yeah.
And if we're really honest.
Yeah,
And so actually in these studies, what it is it really means unmeasured, like doesn't actually think through the unintended consequences of decisions, doesn't look around the corner, more likely to leap without the right requisite skills or plan, right? So it's not the good kind of risk taking that men are more likely to, ready, fire, aim, to raise their hand to do something they're unqualified to do, to sort of go run quickly towards something without a game plan, right? See my earlier point. But even in the literature, right, I found myself saying, oh, we're less risk takers. That's a bummer. And of course, that too is because of biases about how we define risk and how we think about risk. I spoke with several experts on this, and one said something that stuck with me so intently, which was, I wonder if we would be in such deep hot water if half of the market making tech companies, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, MySpace, whatever, if at least half of those were started by women, because women would not have been like, oh, people are going to misuse this to spread fascist rumors. Like women would have been like, let's think about the 101 ways in which this could go awry and let's plan now for that, right? So even the idea of risk is in how we think of it is sort of gendered. So I got under the hood of that a little too.
Really, really interesting and so relevant to where we are today. I was going to ask a little bit about what does innovation mean in this space, and you've really covered that. I want to get to some of the questions. I always have more, but I want to get to some of the questions here. And there's one from, let's see. Oh, here we go. From Adolpha. Hello, Adolpha. In a corporate life where many managers have no training in leadership, let alone DEI, how can they be reached to make adaptive change? We all know that people quit managers, not the job. And I think that's part of what I'm hearing as well. As somebody, very senior woman who is just sick of her boss told me recently, quitting is the new self-care. Now that's obviously, not everybody can do that. You have to have some resources behind you in order to be able to make that move. But we know that that's something that a lot of women are doing. We are at a 33-year low in female employment. Women who've been chased from the workplace because of what they've had to deal with this past year, particularly with homeschooling their children. But I think that question, there's a lot of people in the middle and a lot of people at the bottom of these organizations who are looking at the dude wall and saying, how do I reach them?
Yep.
So any help you can give us on that score?
I mean, that's why I do what I do, right? So when I first left Newark as the superintendent, originally I started Third Way Solutions, which I thought was going to be a short-term consulting gig to breathe because it was such a huge job. And frankly, I had people following me to dinner and, I mean, it was so public. It was, that part of it was exhausting. But I've stayed because I'm so dedicated to, getting under the hood and answering questions, doing the work, not just talking about this question, but I'll give you a couple of examples. So one is, we know what good managers do, right? They vision set, they help each of their team members have a clear set of goals and also a clear set of values against which they're accountable. We often miss that, right? So we typically, sometimes we get to the point where everybody knows what their goals are and how to plan weekly and monthly against those goals, but then we don't actually say, hey, here at this company, we value evidence-based feedback two-way. We value individuals who go out of their way to ask questions and spend time with people who don't share their same identity. We value people who, lift up others and they're in pursuit of their goals as much as their own. We value, so one is there's like, first you got to set the overall North Star, and then everyone has to have their set of deliverables, but also the values against which they're accountable. And then you have rituals where, as the manager, right, you're giving feedback in pursuit of goals, but also values, and you're taking a time out and getting some back, right? So in every check-in in every organization I've led, whether it was a $1 billion enterprise or 9 people, right? There's the moment where you say, okay, now I'm putting my pen down. How can I be in service of your goals? And what feedback do you have for me about whether or not I'm upholding our values, right?
Mm-hmm.
So two-way feedback, direction setting, values-based work, and then of course, culture building, which is all about creating that psychological and emotional safety where team members give each other feedback, hold each other accountable, lift each other up, and to your point, know when to take a time out and have a group hug and go get some coffee, right? So those are the sort of characteristics of good management. I'm just, speaking generally here. You can learn those things. You can practice those things. You can sharpen those things. And, again, companies that have, I will make another bet. Companies that are investing in training their managers in things like that will get ahead. I mean, it is that simple. And companies who don't, I think, are going to slowly implode. Now, sadly, to your point, Peggy, there's going to be a lot of damage along the way, and there already has been. And so part of our work, my work, our work here has got to be to help people understand that retaining and coaching managers for qualities like that is not a nice to have. It is an urgent must have, not just for moral reasons. You and I would say it's appalling that most of the jobs that have been lost are women. Okay, it's also very bad business.
Yes.
Right. So one is just we all have to make a collective case for this being an urgent need and an urgent priority in corporate America and in America generally. Right. 1, 2, we have to make sure we have a wide array of folks that can help coach and support organizations to do this work. That's partly what we do, and it's partly why I've stayed in this. I never fully understood what an important lever this is for change. Do you know what I mean? Like, I just didn't fully appreciate it until I was in it. And then I was like, oh gosh, if we can get organizations to be like much smarter about values-based management that is rooted in diversity, equity, inclusion, that's like a huge lever for change. So we need people to value it. And then 3, I think we need more and more external ways of holding companies accountable for it. I mean, they're starting to pop up sort of indices, whether it's surveys that go beyond just like what percentage of people do you have in your C-suite and on your board, although that would be good too, yeah. Right? So in England, as an example, they actually set a quota about how many women had to be on corporate boards, and within 5 years, it had dramatically changed the picture. So representation is part of it. It's not all of it, right? To your point, you then also have to have quality of management and what employees are saying and feeling. So I think the third piece is really and I've been thinking a lot about this lately. I'm not sure I have the perfect answer yet, but I've been talking to a lot of other DEI professionals, like what's the accountability metric?
Yes.
For companies that will create a sense of urgency around this, as well as a sort of internal pressure.
Right. We interviewed Lily Zhang last week, and one of the things that she talked about is for a long, long time in DEI, the principal metric was, did people like the unconscious bias training? And that was the only metric that we had. And we know it's like people always like it. It's very, very rare to get a survey back saying that people didn't enjoy the training. So I think that conversation about metrics is something that we've been talking a lot about at Watermark, and a couple of our board members, one of our board members is from SurveyMonkey, and we did a whole community forum with her talking about what are those things that you measure, what kind of employee surveys matter, how do you measure that sense of safety, right, that you're talking about. So I'm curious if you have anything to add there in terms of metrics that you're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, so first of all, I would say if everyone says good things or feels good about the unconscious bias training, you might be doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Because part of the growth is discomfort. And I say that to say, we don't do one-shot wonders. And I'm not saying people shouldn't. I'm not passing judgment. Partly because in some ways there's a rawness involved in growth and not shame. I'm not about the shame. People don't, kids don't learn when they feel shame. Adults don't learn when they feel shame. But discomfort, right? So most growth occurs when there's some discomfort, when you're confronting things you may previously have not. And this goes across, right? This goes across isms. So sometimes, right, if you're doing a 10-part series or if you're doing a year-long piece of work, there's going to be 2 or 3 times when if you surveyed everyone, they feel a little not awesome, right? Again, I'm not talking about the shame kind, that I'm not here for that. No one, there's something called the shame compass in psychological research, which basically is if you're far on the shame compass, your growth isn't happening. So I'm not talking about that kind, but discomfort. Having said that, I mean, I would say there's sort of 4 things that I think are decent bellwethers of what a company's doing, right? One is, of course, ultimately who's at power table. So that's your board, that's your C-suite, right? 2 is managers and people who've moved into management positions, right? So again, change doesn't happen over time, overnight. So if you just take a static metric and you don't look at a year-over-year growth metric, then it can lead to some really weird perverse incentives. So you want to look at growth as well in terms of the decision-making tables and also the management roles, not just static, but in growth, right? And again, when you look at diversity, you want to make sure you're looking at it in a pretty inclusive and expansive manner. Yes, you want more Black folks at senior tables, and you have to look at gender, you have to look at people who openly identify as LGBTQ, differently abled, so in an inclusive manner. And then I do think there's a handful. I've been looking at a lot of survey data because I'm a school person. So, as an example, in school literature, there are probably a dozen questions that turn out to be super predictive of student achievement. I think the same is true in corporate culture, right? So it is things like people notice when I'm struggling, even when I don't ask. I have a relationship. I have a best friend at work, believe it or not, is a big one. I trust my manager. I get clear and evidence-based feedback. So we have 1,001 survey questions. I'm comfortable dissenting, but there's a dozen, just like in school land, there's like a dozen that turn out to be pretty predictive of your culture. So I think understanding what those questions are and tracking them, both again, static and growth. And then finally, when looking at hiring, I talked about this earlier, looking at the entire continuum. So you want to look at who's in the pool, and again, not at management and the C-suite. So looking at the entire pool, and then what does the pool look like at first round? What does the first round look second? So tracking the entire pool is another really, really key metric, because that's the key that can steer you into where you might be missing the mark. Like, where does that disconnect occur? Did you start with a non-diverse pool? Did you get all the way to the manager hire and then lose the diversity of the pool? Was it the paper screen, right? Yeah. So, back in my days at Teach for America and New Leaders for New Schools, we interviewed thousands and thousands of people for a small number of spots, and we were vigilant in looking at that whole continuum every year to see if there were any biases that showed up at any point in the continuum. So I think that piece is also important.
Right, right. So it's not just at the very end when you can say we can't find the candidates. The pipeline is dry. Well, the pipeline is dry for a reason. Yeah, very, very interesting. Very interesting. I want to make sure that I'm not missing, excuse me, missing any questions here. We have about 10 minutes left, so please, everybody, if you have, we posted some of your articles because people want to dive in. That's great. I think I've gotten to everything. So please, everybody, keep on asking your questions. I really appreciate it. I want to ask you I wanted to ask you a personal question because you came to this work from a very specific background. So can you talk a little bit about that and what you have learned just from that personal experience?
Yeah, sure. So I am one of 12 kids. Same two parents. My dad was actually an organizer, started his career in Watts. My mom was a family support therapist in East LA, and they had 3 kids and adopted 9. Let's see, but from the time I was 3 to the time I was 12, someone new joined our family through adoption. And in every case, it was because of, some of the atrocities and lack of equities in the child welfare system. So everyone had a story. For example, 2 of my sisters came from Vietnam and they're half Black and half Vietnamese. And they were supposed to be placed in an Asian family, but they looked Black. And when they got off the plane, the Asian family said, no, thank you. And they came home with us, right? There was another instance of a brother, one of my brothers had been in 9 group homes from the time he was 3. And, of course, that will create so much angst no matter what. So he was exhibiting some not terrific behaviors. And so he was in a locked psych ward. And they had essentially, said that he was going to be institutionalized for the rest of his life. And, we met him and he came home with us. So anyway, in every case, right, it was not the birth, sort of typical, I don't know, whatever typical means, everyone came because there was a story. 9 of us are within 3 years of one another in age. We had 1 working bathroom growing up. And both my parents were civil servants, so it wasn't a money thing either. And, I always say that the white, able-bodied, cis heterosexual folks in my family were the minority. And we had Sunday meetings every Sunday for as long as I can remember, where we not only talked about logistics and soccer schedules and laundry nights and kitchen nights and work wheels, but also privilege and race and how it showed up in our daily lives, and ableism and restorative circles when something happened in the family. So, I jokingly say I grew up in a therapeutic learning community, which of course I did not have that privilege. And you can imagine we had plenty of complaints about said meeting. And yet, even now when something happens, right, something tragic or good, there's like either the virtual or the actual like family circle. And we always laugh. We're like, oh, all those years we spent complaining, but it's a pretty useful tool,
Very useful tool. Well, that was one of the things I was thinking about is people often say, white people haven't had to have these conversations, and so they haven't had any practice, right? Mm-hmm. They haven't had any practice with the negotiation, with the considering other people's their stories and where they have come from. And so it's very interesting. You learned that in your family.
Well, I feel so privileged. And to your point, I went from there to Berkeley before they ended affirmative action. And I was a peer counselor. And the time when we all had to take ethnic studies, we all had to take cross-cultural, freshman seminar together. And so, it wasn't until I would say probably my first year at Teach for America where I was like, oh, white people don't talk about race? Like, that's a thing? Like, I didn't even know it was a thing. And it was an interesting awakening for me to, hold myself to a higher standard of at first I was very frustrated by that. And my way of coping was, frankly, I didn't have a lot of white friends. I mean, I couldn't, it was my sort of college rebellion. And then, over time, I've taken my role in helping everyone. And again, I don't see isms as just race. There's a lot. I mean, and partly because of my family, I feel just as strongly about ableism and mental health and LGBTQ status and transgender, because we have it all.
Mhm.
Um, and so I've really tried to hold myself to a high standard of being in that conversation, of never checking out. That's the other thing, is once white folks decide they're going to lean in, they can always lean out. So I try to hold myself to a high standard of never doing that, even though I can, as much as I sort of can't because of my family. I can, right? And I'm raising a biracial son now, so it's been a very interesting time to be doing that. I'm just given the omnipresent conversation about race, but I feel so blessed and so lucky to have had that experience so young, so much practice, which means I've had so much practice, I know how much more practice I need.
Mhm.
But I really feel like it shaped me, and how I move. My principal, my first year, by the way, of teaching, I taught middle school kids who'd been suspended. Well, rather 5-6, a 5-6 class of kids who'd been suspended, or had behavior trouble. And my principal was like, "Oh my gosh, these systems are incredible! Like all of these things." And I was like, "Oh, that's just Sunday at my house." So I was like, "You can thank, both my parents, but especially my mom." So I was like, "Oh yeah, that's just a Sunday. That's just like a Sunday, Anderson logistics meeting." So I'm very, very grateful for my upbringing, and I say I bring my living room with me everywhere I go.
Right.
And that's also why, no matter where I've been, right, whether it's working with corporations, working in government, working in schools, my North Star has always been, unshakable. And people are always like, "Well, what are you going to do next?" I'm like, "I don't know. I know that I will be fundamentally part of a generation helping to make the world more racially and otherwise just. And how I do that is wide open. Whether or not I'm doing that has never been up for discussion. I'm grateful for that too."
Wonderful, wonderful. That's so great. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate you sharing your story. Um, I was asking a question here in the chat. In going between K through 12 education spaces and that lingo, and corporate spaces and that lingo, what's the translation process been like in bridging those two industries that are connected yet have their own particularities? I think it's such an interesting question, because you're right, there's like a language for each space that you operate in, but it also, you've already talked a lot about the commonalities
Yes.
in
It's,
terms of measurements and everything else.
the older you get, the more you realize everything is everything. It's like, right? The concept of psychological, emotional, and physical safety, the idea of technical and adaptive change, the 6P framework that we use: people, policy, practices, principles, power dynamics, the idea of stop, start, sustain. I mean, there are just universal things that, what good management looks like and sounds like, how change feels like, the sort of arc of change. And so there are some really universal truths. That said, of course, everyone has their lingo. I think, now that I've worked across such diverse organizations, I jokingly say I'm an organizational ethnographer. So I was actually an anthropology major in college, which
Me too.
and I used to jokingly say totally useless, except it wasn't totally useless,
It
right?
was not totally useless. No, I found it a very interesting lens.
And I feel like no matter what space, because even corporate America, right, within every corporation, there's its own cadence, and certainly there are certain sectors that have, ways of moving. But any organization that I enter, right, I'm like listening for patterns. I'm listening for assets. I'm listening for common pain points. I'm listening for language, so that when I'm playing things back, people can hear it because I'm meeting them where they are, right? So I think it's kind of a both and, right? It's like there's so much that's universal. It's like incredible now that I've run so many organizations and now I've worked with in this last 5 years, probably, I don't know, 50 or so, and across such a diverse space that it's like, yes, and at the same time, I think being an effective changer of organizations requires like almost an ethnographic lens to really, meet folks where they are. And it's interesting because even within, like I was saying, even within, school district X versus Y, it's like they call the exact same thing something totally different, right?
Yeah.
So you have to, hold on to the universal truths, but also really, I think, be a quick study and understand how organizations move. And I think that's something that I've always liked, but I've gotten really good at in the last 5 years because I just, to your point, lots of practice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's so interesting. What I loved about being an anthropology major, it does teach you that things could be otherwise, because you've got across all other human societies, it's like people have organized it differently. And so why can't we? And I love that. I love that sort of orientation. It makes you kind of brave about the way things, yeah, it doesn't have to be this way. We can change it
Yeah.
because people always do.
And
I'm
anthropology, that there you go. I used to
there,
joke
yeah.
about it, and now I'm like, I'm owning it.
Exactly. Exactly. I always like to ask people, we only have a couple minutes left, but I always like to ask people, what's giving you hope right now?
I mean, I look at people like my son. He just turned 11, and I look at young people and I think about how they think about constructs like race and gender identity, and equity, and I just feel like they are on a whole other level of competence when it
Mhm.
comes to that. Like, for example, literally, I think it's like triple the number of kids say they have a close friend of another race than even a generation ago, or know someone who is questioning their gender identity, or insert any number of important questions there. And they just have a way of seeing the world that feels just so much more inherently equitable and inclusive, partly because of exposure, partly because young people are often less encumbered by all of our internalized stuff that grown-ups carry. And I think that's partly why I keep coming back to making sure that there's always an anchor piece of work for me in young people. And that's why I'm so obsessed with things like discipline policy and school culture, because we squash that in
Yeah.
some kids, and we let it fly in some kids, and we squash it in Black and brown kids, and in kids who are questioning gender and whatnot. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that if we adults can organize ourselves in a way that create the right container and space for them, that the conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion will be not slightly, but radically different in all good ways in like just a decade. Like, if we don't squash it, and better yet, if we organize our corporations, our schools, our government in a way that allows the young people coming up now to really lead the way, then I think we're going to be in a really different place in all good ways. So that gets me up, puts a spring in my step, and also really motivates me to do all the work that I do, to work with grown-ups across all these different organizations, so that we can just get the space ready for them to come in and bring the real revolution. That's gonna be fun.
That will be fun. That is fantastic. Well, we are right at 1 o'clock. So thank you so much for being here today. We could go on and on this. I think you have so much to talk about, so much to teach us. So I really appreciate you spending time with us today. And for those of you who are still on the call, I want to let you know that we will be talking about innovation in other spaces coming up in June. We will have a conversation with Hunter Levins, who is an environmental icon and the founder of something called Natural Capitalism Solutions, who's going to talk about the disruption that is coming through climate change. There's another place where I'm really depending on the young people who are coming up to make this a huge priority. But I'm very excited about those programs. And thank you again for being with us. Those of you who are not Watermark members, I hope you will consider supporting us with a membership. We like to make our programming available as widely as possible, and your support helps us do that. So thank you again, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Cami, for being here. I hope this is the first of many.
It was so great, Peggy. Thank you so much. And it's nice to
you.
meet everyone. And I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. See you live soon.
I know, that'd be great.
Yes, can't wait. Okay, bye.